On a freezing winter night in the Colorado mountains, a wealthy father drove away, leaving his 8-year-old daughter and her loyal canine alone to die on an empty road. Just as her last bit of warmth was slipping away, a Navy SEAL heard a faint cry buried in the wind and followed it, unaware that he was stepping into the darkest secrets of a powerful family. This is a story of betrayal, danger, and the quiet miracle that happens when strangers choose to protect a child the world tried to abandon. Chamois. The wind came first, slamming into the side of the black SUV so hard the frame shuddered. Snow spun in the headlights in thick, wild sheets, more like torn linen than falling flakes. The mountain road twisted along the side of the ridge, somewhere above Silverton, Colorado. But at that moment, the world could just as well have been the moon. There was nothing to see beyond the guardrail but darkness and the roar of winter. In the back seat, 8-year-old Emma Hayes hugged herself and watched her own breath fog in front of her face. The heater was set low. It always was when her father drove. He said it helped him stay alert. Her fingertips burned with that needle-prick sting that meant they were cold and trying not to be. Beside her, pressed so close their shoulders touched, lay Ranger. He was big for a German shepherd, thick winter coat, heavy muscles beneath. His dark ears twitched with every gust of wind. When the SUV hit a patch of rough pavement, he braced his paws and leaned into Emma so she wouldn't slide. His warm breath puffed against her wrist. Her fingers found the rough fur at the back of his neck and stayed there, clinging, like maybe if she held on tight enough, the storm couldn't find her. Up front, the dashboard glow painted her father's profile in pale blue. Robert Hayes was still a handsome man, the kind magazines liked to photograph when they ran features about self-made millionaires. Strong jaw, expensive haircut, coat that had never seen a second-hand rack in its life. The steering wheel fit in his hands like it belonged to him. He had not spoken for the last 20 minutes. "Dad?" Emma's voice was small in the heavy silence. "Are we almost there?" His eyes stayed on the road. "Almost," he said. The word came out flat. No warmth, no smile. "You and that dog just sit still." Emma swallowed. "Ranger," she corrected softly. "His name is—" "I know his name," Robert snapped, one hand tightening on the wheel. "You've said it enough." Ranger's ears flicked back. He didn't growl, didn't move, just stared at the back of Robert's head for a long, thoughtful moment, then looked away again. Outside, the snow thickened. The headlights carved only a few feet into the white curtain before the storm swallowed the light. Roadside markers appeared and vanished like ghosts. The tires hissed over packed snow and patches of ice, chains clicking now and then in a rhythm that sounded too much like a clock running out. Emma pressed her forehead against the cold glass and squinted. Somewhere out there, buried under that white, was the town. Her school. The grocery store where the lady at the deli counter always slipped her an extra slice of cheese. Home had once been attached to those things, before everything changed, before the new house with the high ceilings and the glass walls and the perfect pictures on the mantelpiece, before Tiffany. Ranger shifted, pressing his head into her lap. Instinctively, she curled around him, fingers tangling in his thick ruff. He had been the first being in that new life who didn't look at her like a problem to be solved. He'd stared at her through the kennel bars with calm, serious eyes, then licked her hand when she reached in. Evelyn at the rescue had said, "He chooses you, honey. That's good." It had felt like the first good thing in a long time. The SUV slowed. Emma's head came up. The road here narrowed, dropping off into a ravine on one side, a wall of rock on the other. No lights, no houses. Just snow piled along the guardrail like frozen waves. The storm pressed close, stuffing the world with gray. "Why are we stopping?" she asked. Robert's jaw flexed. "Ranger needs to go out," he said. "Dog's been cramped up for hours. I'm not having him ruin the leather." He eased the SUV over until the right tires bumped the snowbank. The engine idled, a soft humming presence in the cold. For a moment, he just sat there, staring through the windshield at nothing. Emma's stomach fluttered. "Can't we wait until we're in town?" she tried. "It's really cold, Dad." He turned then, finally looking back at her. His eyes were light, almost the same color as the ice on the windows, and tonight there was something in them she didn't recognize. Not the annoyance she was used to, not even the tired, heavy anger that had settled there after Mom died. This was emptier. "You'll be fine," he said. "You've got that dog, don't you?" Ranger lifted his head as if he understood his part had just been called. Robert unlocked the doors. The click sounded sharp in the small space. "Come on, get out. Let him stretch his legs. I'll turn the car around and pick you up in a minute." Pick you up in a minute. The words should have been harmless. They sat in the air like a promise. But somewhere under Emma's ribs, a little knot tightened. Ranger hopped down first when the door opened, his paws hitting the snow with a muffled thump. The wind knifed into the car, carrying a spray of ice crystals and a slap of air so cold it stole Emma's breath. She slid down after him, boots crunching through the top crust into something soft and deep beneath. The cold bit through her jeans in an instant. "Stay right there by the rail," Robert said. His voice carried oddly in the wind, ripped apart and blown away. "Don't wander. I'll be right back." Emma shivered and pulled her coat tighter around her. She watched him shift the SUV into gear. The wheels spun for a moment, then found purchase. The whole vehicle rocked. "Dad," she called, "it's really cold. Can I just stay inside with Ranger? I can hold his leash out the door." But the window was already rolling up. His face behind the glass was a pale oval in the dashboard light, expression unreadable. For half a heartbeat, their eyes met. Emma lifted a hand. The SUV pulled away. She stood there, stunned, as the taillights glowed red through the blowing snow, outlining the curve of the road ahead. The engine sound faded under the roar of the wind. Ranger moved close, leaning against her leg, his body a steady weight. "Dad!" she shouted, louder this time. "Dad, wait!" The wind grabbed her words and flung them back at her, thin and broken. The SUV slowed at the next bend, brake lights blooming brighter, and hope jumped in her chest so fast it hurt. "He's turning around," she thought. "He's just looking for a wider spot. He has to be." She started forward, boots slipping, one hand digging into Ranger's fur to keep from falling. Snow pelted her face, clung to her lashes. She blinked hard and kept going, following the twin tracks the tires had left in the white. "Dad, please!" The SUV reached the bend. It did not turn. It rounded the corner and vanished, swallowed whole by storm and darkness. The red glow disappeared like someone had snuffed out a candle. Emma stumbled to a stop. The world rushed in around her, huge and empty and loud. For a moment she stood perfectly still, listening, waiting for the sound of an engine reversing, for headlights to swing back into view, for anything. Nothing came. The cold found its way through her coat, through her sweater, into her bones. Her legs began to shake. The snow around her boots deepened with every gust, filling in the shallow prints she had just made. Behind her, the spot where the SUV had been stopped was already smoothing over, its absence covered. "Maybe he can't turn around yet," she whispered, though there was no one to hear but Ranger. Maybe he has to go farther." Ranger pressed closer, chest heaving with each breath. His ears were pinned back against his head, eyes narrowed against the ice. He looked down the road the way the SUV had gone, then back at Emma, then up at the ridge. His body went tense, as if every instinct inside him was screaming the same thing. "This is wrong." Emma tried to walk again, but her boots slipped. The snow came almost to her knees now, where it had drifted. The wind shoved her sideways. Her teeth chattered so hard her jaw ached. "Dad," she tried again, voice cracking. "Daddy, come back." The only answer was the hiss of snow across asphalt and the hollow moan of the storm winding through the rocks. Her vision blurred. At first she thought it was more snow in her eyes, but when she wiped at her face with her mitten, her bare skin came away wet and hot. Tears froze on her lashes. She turned back toward the place where they had been parked and saw something that made her heart sink in a new way. The tire tracks were already fading, edges softening, lines filling in. In a little while, there would be nothing left to show any car had been there at all. No marker, no sign. Just a girl and her dog on a mountain road. Her knees buckled. The world tipped for a moment, gray and white, and spinning. Before she could hit the ground, Ranger shouldered under her, taking some of her weight, easing her down more gently than any grown man could have. She ended up on her knees in the snow, arms wrapped around his neck, face buried in the warm, rough fur between his ears. "I'm so cold," she whispered. Her lips were numb. It was hard to move them. "Ranger, I'm so cold." He made a low sound, something between a whine and a rumble, and folded himself around her as best he could. His body heat seeped into her front while the storm clawed at her back. His tail curled against her legs, his breath puffed steadily against her cheek. Minutes went by. Or maybe longer. Time didn't feel right anymore. The cold grew heavier. It settled on her shoulders, crept into her chest. The road disappeared. The guardrail became a dim suggestion under a blanket of snow. The sky and the ground blended together until there was no line between them. Emma's eyes drifted half shut. Somewhere far away, she thought she heard a different sound, something cutting through the wind instead of being part of it. A distant crunch of boots on ice. A voice, maybe, calling out into the night. She wanted to answer. Her mouth wouldn't move. The last thing she felt before the darkness closed in was Ranger's heart thudding against her arm, stubborn and strong, beating back against a storm that did not care if either of them lived or died. The storm had swallowed most of the mountains by the time Ethan Walker stepped away from the fire. The camp's orange glow flickered behind him, dim and fragile against the white chaos rolling across the ridge. Snow lashed at the hood of his parka, stinging his cheeks with sharp, needling cold. But it wasn't the weather that pushed him out into the darkness. It was the silence, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty at all, but strained like something underneath is trying to break through. He paused at the edge of the clearing, boots sinking into the fresh powder. Behind him, Logan Pierce was muttering about the temperature while wrestling with the zipper of his sleeping bag. Logan always talked too much when he was uncomfortable. It was one of the things Ethan tolerated because he couldn't bring himself to dislike the man. Chaplain Ben Miller was kneeling near the fire pit, coaxing a low flame into something stronger, his breath rising in soft clouds. Ethan closed his eyes. For a moment, all he heard was the wind and the quiet pop of the firewood Ben was feeding. The storm pressed in around the camp like a living thing, full of shifting gusts and buried echoes. Then he heard it. A faint, distant sound carried on the wind, thin, frayed, hardly more than a thread of noise. But it cut straight through the storm and hit Ethan in the chest like a memory he'd spent years trying to bury. A dog's bark, weak, struggling, followed by something even worse, a high, trembling whimper that didn't sound like any grown animal. Ethan's eyes snapped open. "Ben?" he said, his voice low. The chaplain glanced up, blinking snowflakes from his lashes. "You all right?" "There's something out there." "Just the storm," Logan called without looking up. "This place howls like a haunted trumpet. Don't let it mess with your head." Ethan didn't answer. He stepped farther into the darkness, cupping a hand around his ear like he used to during recon missions. The wind shifted. Temperature dropped another notch. The sound came again, this time a little clearer, a little sharper. A cry, not a bark. A voice. A child's voice swallowed by the storm. He turned back toward the camp. "You hear that?" Logan shoved himself upright. "Man, don't start this again. It's the cold. Cold does weird stuff to the ears." Ben stood slowly, brushing off his knees. He watched Ethan for a long moment, the firelight catching the deep lines around his eyes. "Tell me what you heard." Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to say it out loud. Saying it made it real, and real meant responsibility, a kind he didn't think he was ready for again. Not after Alaska, not after Shadow, not after all the ways he had failed to bring people home. But the storm didn't care what he was ready for. "A dog," he said. "Hurt. And a kid. Crying." Logan snorted. "Sure, in a blizzard, on a road nobody uses this time of year. You want to check for ghosts next?" Ben didn't smile. He stepped closer until he was beside Ethan, scanning the ridge as if looking through the dark instead of into it. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "God sends the same message twice, first in a whisper, then in a shove." Ethan let out a breath that frosted in front of him. This one felt like a shove. "Then you follow it," Logan groaned. No. Ben, don't encourage this. We are not going out there. We've got one tent, one half-decent fire, and the weather's about to eat us alive." But Ben's hand settled on Ethan's shoulder with the weight of a calm certainty Ethan had relied on more times than he could count. "Ethan," Ben said softly, "you've always heard things the rest of us miss." Ethan closed his eyes again. The cry was faint now, stretched thin by the storm, but it was still there, barely, but there. He opened his eyes. "I'm going." Logan threw his hands up. "Of course you are. Great, fantastic. I'll just stay here and freeze like a normal idiot." Ben stepped forward. "Take a flare, and the thermals, and for heaven's sake, stay within sight of the ridge. If you go down the wrong slope, we won't find you till June." Ethan grabbed his pack, slung it over his shoulder, checked the flashlight, then checked it again. He pulled his scarf up over his mouth. Logan pointed at him. "If you come back with frostbite, I get to say I told you so for the next 5 years." "Deal," Ethan said. Then he turned and walked toward the white wall of the storm. Every step sank deep. The wind shoved at him, tugging at his coat, pushing his shoulders sideways. His breath turned to crystals that blew back into his face. The flashlight cut only a narrow blade of light through the swirling snow, but he kept walking, listening, adjusting his direction every time the faint sound shifted. He didn't know how long he walked, 5 minutes, 10, 20. The storm warped time the same way it warped distance, stretching everything until it felt unreal. Twice he almost turned back. Twice something in him tightened and pulled him forward again. And then he heard it, clear enough that the storm couldn't hide it anymore. A bark, rough, weak, followed by a thin cry that made his stomach turn cold in a way the weather never could. He picked up speed, boots punching holes in the fresh drifts. The wind ripped at his coat, but he pushed harder. His chest ached. His breath came out in ragged bursts. The flashlight beam shook in his hand. He reached a rise in the slope and angled the light downward. His heart dropped. A small, still shape lay half buried in the snow beside the guardrail. Something dark curled around it, moving, breathing, struggling. Ethan slid down the slope on instinct, snow flying up around him. His knees hit the ground beside the two shapes before he registered the pain. A shepherd. Big, strong, shivering violently, curled around a little girl who looked far too small against the storm. Ethan dropped the flashlight into the snow and pulled off his gloves, hands shaking as he turned the girl gently toward him. Her lashes were crusted with ice. Her skin was pale blue around the mouth. Her breathing came in thin, shallow puffs. "Hey," he said, voice low and steady, the tone he'd used 100 times in combat when panic would have killed someone. "Hey, sweetheart, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. Barely. The dog growled softly, not at Ethan, but at the cold, at the storm, at whatever had left them here. His body trembled as he tried to stay wrapped around her. "It's okay, boy," Ethan whispered. "I've got her now." He slipped the emergency blanket from his pack, wrapped it around the girl first, then around the dog, tucking both into his chest as best he could. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and for a heartbeat he felt the terrifying stillness of a body too cold for too long. Then she breathed again, a thin puff of air against his neck. "What's your name?" he murmured, lifting her gently. "Come on, sweetheart, stay with me." Her lips moved. He bent closer. "Emma," she whispered, barely there. "His name is Ranger." Ranger pressed his head weakly against Ethan's arm, as if to confirm it. Ethan gathered them both, tightening his grip, feeling the urgency settle into his bones. "All right, Emma. Ranger, we're getting out of here." He stood, bracing himself against the wind. Somewhere behind them, miles back, Logan was probably cursing into the fire. Ben was probably praying. Ethan didn't know if anyone else in the world had heard that cry. But he had. And now there was no force on earth or in the storm that would stop him from bringing this little girl home. Ciao. The trek down the ridge felt longer than it was. Snow clung to Ethan's eyelashes, turning every blink into a small scrape of ice, but he kept moving, one steady step at a time. Emma was light in his arms, far too light for a child her age. Ranger limped beside him, leaning into his leg whenever the wind shoved too hard against them. Ethan shifted the girl's weight closer to his chest, trying to shield as much of her as he could. He'd carried wounded soldiers through storms uglier than this, but somehow the small rise and fall of Emma's breath against his coat hit harder than any battlefield memory. A faint glow finally appeared between the trees, a single square of warm light in a world of white. Ethan angled toward it, boots sinking deep into the drifts as he made the last climb down into the valley. The storm softened slightly near the trees, the wind breaking around the trunks instead of knifing straight through him. Ranger huffed, stumbling once before catching himself. Ethan reached down and steadied him. "Almost there, buddy. Keep going." The cabin came into view piece by piece, a dark roof capped in snow, a brick chimney puffing out thin curls of smoke, windows glowing the warm amber of lantern light. Ethan knew the place. He'd passed through this valley before, talked with the couple who lived here over cups of strong coffee and quiet conversation. He prayed they were home tonight. He climbed the porch steps and knocked hard with his elbow. The door opened almost immediately. Walt Miller filled the doorway like an old oak tree. Broad-shouldered, snow-dusted beard, lines around his eyes carved by decades of mountain wind. His expression shifted from surprise to alarm in an instant. "Good Lord, Ethan." "We need heat," Ethan said. "Now. Child's in stage 1 hypothermia. Dog's close." Walt stepped back without another question. "Get in here." The cabin warmth hit Ethan like a physical shove. It smelled of pine wood, old quilts, and stew simmering somewhere unseen. Irene Miller appeared from the kitchen, apron still on, her silver-streaked hair braided down her back. She froze at the sight of Emma in Ethan's arms. "Oh, dear," she breathed. "Bring her to the hearth." Ethan carried Emma to the thick rug in front of the fireplace. Irene laid out blankets, her hands trembling only for a moment before settling into the practiced steadiness of someone who'd tended to too many emergencies in her life. Ranger sank down beside Emma as soon as Ethan lowered her, pressing his body against her hip. Irene peeled off Emma's outer layers with careful movements, checking fingers, face, neck. "She's cold, but she's not past the line," she murmured. "She'll come back with time and warmth." Walt added wood to the fire, coaxing the flames higher until the entire hearth glowed. Ethan knelt, rubbing warmth back into Emma's hands through the thin wool of his gloves. Her eyelashes fluttered, but didn't open. "What happened out there?" Walt asked quietly. Ethan hesitated. "I found her alone in the storm. No car, no adults." He paused, jaw tightening. "Tracks say a vehicle pulled off the road and left. Drove away." Walt's eyebrows lowered, his frown deepening. "Left her?" "That's what it looks like." Irene's breath caught. She rested a hand gently on Emma's cheek, thumb brushing the pale skin. Who could do such a thing? Ethan didn't answer. He didn't trust his voice not to break into anger he hadn't earned the right to express. Not yet. A soft whine drew his attention. Ranger lay stretched along Emma's side, eyes half closed, chest rising in uneven breaths. Ethan reached for him automatically. Something under his fingers snagged against the dog's thick coat. A thin strip of worn leather hung from Ranger's collar, bearing a metal tag dulled by years of use. He rubbed his thumb over it, brushing away the frost. "Avalanche Rescue Program Unit 7, K9, Ranger Colorado Division." Beneath it, barely visible, was the old imprint of a partnership symbol, a unit insignia he knew too well. Not the same as Shadow's, but close enough to make Ethan's breath hitch. Same training branch. Same program. "Where'd you come from?" Ethan murmured. Ranger's ear twitched. His tail thumped once, weak but determined. Footsteps moved beside him. Irene had wrapped Emma in 2 quilts, tucking them carefully around her shoulders. The girl's lips had more color now, though her eyes remained closed. Irene smoothed the hair from Emma's forehead. "She's safe now," Irene whispered. "We'll keep her that way." The words carried a weight Ethan understood more deeply than he wished. The Millers had lost a son on a mountainside years ago, an accident no one could prevent, no one could explain. After that, they'd slipped quietly from the world, staying close to the land they understood. They knew grief. They knew second chances didn't come often. Emma stirred faintly, her small fingers curled into the blanket. "Mom," she mumbled, barely audible. Irene's eyes softened with a sorrow that wasn't new. "She's dreaming." Ethan sat back on his heels. The fire cracked, sending sparks up the chimney. The storm outside battered the walls, but inside the cabin the warmth pressed close and steady. "Walt," Ethan said quietly, "do you still have that spare cot in the back room?" Walt nodded. "You're thinking of staying?" "Until she wakes, until I know she's stable." Walt looked at him a long moment, then gave a firm nod. "You do that. We're here as long as she needs." Ethan exhaled slowly. He didn't realize until then how tightly he'd been holding his breath. Outside, a gust of wind slammed into the cabin wall, rattling the window panes. The flakes against the glass flashed white in the firelight, each one a harsh reminder of how close the storm had come to winning. Emma's breathing evened out. Ranger shifted closer to her, letting his head rest near her shoulder. Irene sat beside them, humming a low tune barely above the crackle of the fire, something that sounded like an old lullaby, worn smooth with use. Ethan rose and stepped toward the window, watching the storm claw at the valley. Somewhere up on that road, a man had made a choice cold enough to match the weather. And tomorrow, when Emma woke, Ethan would need to hear the truth from her small, shaking voice. But tonight, she was warm. Ranger was safe. And the Miller's cabin held the storm at bay. Just before he turned from the window, Ethan caught a faint reflection of himself in the glass. Snow-dusted, worn around the edges, jaw set in a way he hadn't seen since the days when Shadow walked beside him. This time, though, he wasn't walking away from the cry in the dark. This time, he had arrived in time to answer it. Chelmut. Morning came slowly, like the sun itself wasn't sure it wanted to climb over the ridge. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the valley wrapped in a muffled blanket of white. Frost clung to the windows of the Miller cabin, turning the world outside into a quiet watercolor. Inside, the fire had burned low, glowing red at the edges, a soft pulse of warmth against the winter stillness. Emma was the first to stir. Her eyelashes fluttered, brushing against the quilt Irene had tucked under her chin. She blinked, confused, then pushed herself up slightly, one hand still tangled in Ranger's fur. The shepherd lifted his head at once, tail thumping softly. His eyes stayed fixed on her face, watching for every tiny sign of fear or pain. "Easy, sweetheart," Irene murmured from the rocking chair beside the hearth. She had been awake for hours, keeping watch. "You're safe. You're with friends." Emma's gaze darted around the room, fireplace, wooden shelves, braided rug, lantern light, and settled on Ethan leaning against the far wall, arms folded, expression steady. She swallowed and whispered, Where are we?" "You're at our place," Walt said as he stepped in from the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Down in the valley. Storm can't get to you here." Emma nodded slowly, as though marking each piece of information in her mind. Then the memory hit her. Her face crumpled for a second, just a second, and she looked down, pulling Ranger closer to her chest. Irene reached out and covered the girl's trembling hand with her own. Ethan knelt beside them. "Emma," he said gently, "we're going to take this slow. You don't have to talk about anything you're not ready for." But children who've been hurt have a way of holding their stories like they're heavier than they are. They want to let them fall. They just don't always know how. Emma touched her cheek as if surprised to find it warm again. She glanced at Ethan, then at Irene, and her voice came out small and hoarse. "Why did he leave me?" Irene inhaled sharply. Walt stopped moving altogether. Ranger pressed closer, whining softly. Ethan stayed calm. "We don't know yet, Emma, but we're going to figure it out." She shook her head and looked down at her lap. "He said Ranger needed to go out. He told me to help him. Then he drove away. I kept thinking maybe he'd come back. Maybe he needed to turn around." Her voice cracked. "But he didn't?" Irene's hand tightened around hers, warm and steady. Walt turned away to stoke the fire, but his jaw worked, the muscles clenching tight. "Do you remember anything else?" Ethan asked. Emma hesitated. "Dad was mad all morning. Tiffany kept telling him he needed to get things under control. They were talking in the kitchen. They thought I couldn't hear." She paused. "They said I was the reason everything was falling apart." Irene closed her eyes briefly. Emma swallowed. "Tiffany said, she's not even my kid. And Dad didn't say anything." Ethan felt a slow burn settle in his chest, not anger yet, but something close, something cold and steady. "Emma," he said quietly, "your mom, what was she like?" The question softened something in her expression. "She was kind and busy. She worked a lot, but she always kissed me good night when she got home, even if I was already asleep." Irene brushed her hair away from her face. "What happened to her, sweetheart?" Emma took a shaky breath. "Dad said it was an accident in an elevator at his building. They said the cables snapped." Walt muttered something under his breath. Too low for Emma to hear, but not for Ethan. He understood it. "I don't believe that for a second." Emma continued, voice barely above a whisper. "After she died, Dad got different. He started yelling more, staying out late. He stopped letting me go places without Tiffany." Her eyes flicked downward. "Sometimes Tiffany grabbed my arm too hard. She always let go before Dad saw." Ethan exchanged a look with Irene. They had both seen enough neglected kids to recognize the signs. This wasn't a single bad night. This was a long, slow unraveling of something a child should never have had to carry. Emma's fingers drifted to Ranger's collar, rubbing the metal tag. Miss Evelyn at the rescue center told me Ranger came from the mountains. She said he was born to protect people who needed him. She said he picks who he belongs to. Ranger nudged her shoulder as if to confirm it. "What about your dad?" Ethan asked gently. "Did he ever act scared, worried? Anything unusual lately?" Emma thought. "He had a lot of papers on his desk. He and Tiffany argued about money. Sometimes they stopped talking when I came into the room." She hesitated. "Last week I heard Tiffany say, 'Everything depends on her.' Then she saw me in the hallway and slammed the door." Walt looked at Ethan. "Sounds like more than family trouble." "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. Emma tugged at the quilt and whispered, Did I do something bad?" "No, honey," Irene said firmly, quicker than anyone else could respond. "No child ever deserves to be left behind. Ever." Emma stared at the flames. A small tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't seem aware of it. Ethan stood slowly. He motioned Walt toward the kitchen. The two men stepped away from the hearth, far enough that their voices wouldn't reach the girl. "This isn't abandonment," Ethan said in a low voice. "This is intentional." Walt nodded grimly. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Money, custody, control?" Ethan rubbed a hand across his jaw. "The way she talks, the way she flinches when Tiffany's name comes up. Something's been wrong a long time?" "Storm or no storm," Walt said, "that man meant for her not to come home." Ethan didn't disagree. He pulled out his phone and stepped toward the back window where the signal sometimes worked. A bar flickered, then two. Enough. He dialed Detective Maria Sanchez. She answered on the second ring. "Walker, you alive out there?" "Barely," Ethan said. "And I need you. Now." "That bad?" "It's worse." He kept his voice low, relaying what Emma had told him, the details that didn't add up, the elevator accident that suddenly didn't smell like an accident, the new wife, the money troubles, the girl abandoned on a mountain road. Maria listened without interrupting. When she finally spoke, her tone had changed. "I'll run everything," she said. "The mother, the finances, the wife. Hayes is a big name in Colorado real estate. If there's dirt, he spent money to bury it." "Dig it up," Ethan said. A beat of silence. Then, "You think he meant for her to die out there?" "I don't think, Maria." Ethan's eyes drifted toward the small figure curled under the quilt. "I know." Maria exhaled sharply. "I'll call you back within a few hours." Ethan ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. When he returned to the living room, Emma was awake, sipping a cup of warm broth Irene held for her. Ranger lay across her legs, soaking up the heat from the fire. Irene looked up. "She's warming up well. The color's coming back." "Good," Ethan said. "She's going to need her strength." Emma lifted her head. "Am I staying here?" "For now," Ethan said softly. "You're safe with us. That's what matters." Her small shoulders relaxed, just enough to show trust beginning to settle. Ranger huffed and placed a paw across her ankles like a guardian sealing the promise. Outside, the storm had moved on, but inside the cabin, Ethan felt another one beginning to form, the kind made from truth, lies, and the trail of a man willing to sacrifice his own child. And this storm wouldn't be weather. It would be war. By afternoon, the sky had cleared enough for cell towers along the ridge to breathe again. Sunlight spilled over the valley in thin, cold beams, turning the blanket of fresh snow into a sheet of blinding white. Inside the Miller cabin, the warmth hummed steadily, but Ethan felt nothing close to calm. He kept checking his phone, waiting for Maria's call, pacing the wooden floor like a man trying to walk off a storm that lived inside him. It finally rang. He stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching lightly in the snow crust. "Talk to me," he said. Maria's voice came fast, clipped. "Walker, you need to listen. The Hayes family's in deeper trouble than you think." "I figured as much." "No, you didn't." Papers rustled on her end. "Laura Hayes didn't die in an elevator accident." "Not really. The official report was written by a private engineer on Hayes's payroll. State inspectors never signed off. And her life insurance? Massive. All set to transfer into a trust for Emma, locked until she turned 18. Ethan felt the cold cut deeper under his coat. Meaning Robert couldn't touch a dime. Exactly, not without the trustee's approval. But if Emma died before 18, Maria paused. The funds revert to the surviving parent. Ethan closed his eyes. So the girl becomes the obstacle. And an expensive one, Maria said. Robert Hayes is bleeding money. Expansions, failed investments, a lawsuit from a construction firm. He's drowning. Tiffany's no saint either. Half her lifestyle is financed through shell accounts tied to Hayes Peak Resorts. They've been moving money that doesn't belong to them. Ethan exhaled slowly. So abandoning Emma wasn't desperation. It was cleaning up the books. Financial homicide, Maria said grimly. If we can prove intent, he's going down. The porch boards creaked behind Ethan. Walt stepped out, arms crossed against the chill. He didn't interrupt. He just waited, jaw tight. Maria continued. I pulled satellite data from last night. Hayes's SUV was on that mountain road at the exact window Emma said. And guess what? The vehicle's emergency system was disabled 30 minutes prior. Someone didn't want any automated distress. Signals going out. Ethan stared across the valley, fists clenching. He planned it. We need more than suspicion, Maria said. We need direct evidence, documents, footage, anything tying him to the act. A beat passed. Ethan, you're the only one who can get it. But be careful. Hayes has private security, ex-law enforcement, military contractors. They don't spook easy. Send me the address, Ethan said. Already did. Text with floor plans coming through. Her voice softened for half a second. And Ethan? Don't get yourself killed. Bringing down a man like Hayes is easier than explaining to the department why one of my favorite headaches froze to death in the mountains. He ended the call but didn't smile. Walt studied him. That bad? Worse, Ethan said. We need proof, the kind that doesn't get dismissed as rumors. Walt scratched his beard. You heading up there? Tonight. I'm coming. No, Ethan said. Too dangerous. Walt huffed. Son, I'm old, not dead, and I've seen enough of that girl to know she's worth bleeding for. You're not going alone. Ethan didn't argue again. Experience had taught him the value of a good man at your back, and Walt Miller was better than most. Inside the house, Irene was drying Emma's hair by the fire, humming softly. Ranger rested with his head on Emma's lap, eyes half closed, ears twitching with every shift in the room. When Ethan and Walt stepped in, Ranger's gaze snapped alert. Emma looked up. Are you leaving? Ethan knelt beside her. Just for a little while. I need to check something. Her hands tightened in Ranger's fur. Will you come back? Yes, he said. I will? Ranger nudged his arm as if making sure that promise included him too. Walt put on his coat and hat. Irene, stay close to the girl. Lock the doors behind us. Irene nodded. I'll keep her safe. Ethan turned to Emma. You keep Ranger with you. He's trained to protect. Emma nodded, though her small shoulders trembled. Ranger gave a low grunt, something between reassurance and warning. The sun was already dipping when they left the valley. By the time they reached the upper switchback, night had settled over the mountain like a second storm. Quiet, heavy, merciless. The Hayes estate sat on a carved slope overlooking Silverton, a sprawling structure of glass, steel, and money. Warm light glowed from the windows like a stage set. Too perfect, too curated. The kind of house built to impress people who never looked closely. Walt parked down the hill behind a stand of pines. "Fancy," he muttered. Man builds himself a palace and forgets every window cuts both ways. Ethan pulled gear from his bag, thermal gloves, a signal jammer, lockpicks, a compact camera. Walt lifted a brow. "You planning to rob the place or expose it?" "Both," Ethan said. They moved through the trees, silent as shadows. Snow cushioned their steps. The cold burned their lungs, but neither man slowed. From behind the estate, Ethan could see the camera system, 5 external units, overlapping angles, exactly as Maria had predicted. He activated the jammer. The nearest camera flickered, paused, then resumed with a looping feed that would buy them 15 minutes at most. They slipped through the side gate and crossed to the patio doors. Ethan knelt, pulled a small tool, and popped the electronic lock. They stepped inside. Warm air hit them first. Then silence. Too deliberate to be peaceful. The house smelled like polished wood and citrus cleaners. Nothing personal. Nothing lived in. Just room after room, designed to look expensive on camera. Walt shook his head. "You could raise a whole family in this place and still not fill it." Ethan didn't answer. He moved through the hall, scanning quickly. Every photograph in the frames had been staged. Robert standing next to Emma, smiling just a little too wide, Emma's expression stiff, Tiffany posing as if for a magazine spread. None of the warmth you'd expect in a real home. No scribbled drawings, no toys, no proof a child had lived here at all. They reached Robert's office. Ethan opened the door, and his flashlight swept over mahogany shelves, a leather chair, and a desk too clean to be used honestly. Papers sat in tidy stacks. A laptop glowed on sleep mode. Walt closed the door behind them. "Let's make this quick," he said. Ethan began searching. Drawers, folders, filing cabinets. Walt checked the shelves. Nothing stood out until Ethan noticed the small safe built into the wall behind a framed landscape painting. "Well, look at that," Walt murmured. "The rich man's version of a junk drawer?" Ethan crouched, fingers tracing the cold metal keypad. Maria said he stores financials off-site, but anything he didn't want Tiffany to see? It'll be here. He pulled a stethoscope from his bag. Walt blinked. "What are you, a Navy SEAL or a magician?" "Both," Ethan muttered. He worked the dial, listening for the tiny clicks of the tumblers. Minutes passed. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold house. Then, click. The safe opened. Inside were folders stamped with seals from various financial firms, a USB drive, and a small black notebook. Ethan pocketed the notebook and USB immediately. The folders he thumbed through quickly and stopped when he found one with a familiar name, Laura Hayes. He opened it. Inside were insurance documents, handwriting samples, a forensic report, and a memo from Robert's lawyer dated 3 months before Laura's death, reviewing trust modifications and asset transition in the event of beneficiary loss. Walt leaned over his shoulder. Well, damn. Ethan lifted another page. A maintenance request to the company that serviced the elevator where Laura died, signed by a contractor whose license had expired the month before. The accident. Another red flag. He kept digging. A ledger showed money transfers from the trust into a shell company under Tiffany's name. Illegal unless the child's trustee approved it. The trustee's signature line was blank. Then came the final punch. A printed email chain between Robert and Tiffany. "We need the trust accessible before the expansion deal collapses. The girl is the hurdle." It has to look like an accident, something no one survives. Walt exhaled slowly, like a man steadying himself before a blow. He planned it. He planned all of it. Ethan's jaw clenched, and he almost got away with it. A sudden beep cut through the room. Ethan spun. The house security system blinked red on a panel above the door. Walt stiffened. "What's that?" "Camera failure notification," Ethan said. "They know something's wrong." Footsteps sounded in the hall, heavy, confident, practiced. Not police. Private security. Walt whispered, "We've got company." Ethan killed the light. "Time's up." He shoved the folders back in the safe, leaving everything as he'd found it, except the notebook and USB drive he slid into his coat. The footsteps drew closer. Walt pointed to the far door. "Back way." They slipped through the dark, down a service corridor, out into the night, just as the first guard stepped into the office. The men didn't stop until they'd reached the tree line again, lungs burning, breath fogging in the air. Walt finally spoke. "You get what you came for?" Ethan tapped his coat pocket. "Enough to bring him down." Walt nodded. "Then let's get back. That little girl deserves to sleep in peace tonight." But as they turned toward the valley, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling tightening in his chest. Robert Hayes would know someone had been inside his walls. And the kind of man who abandons his own child in a blizzard doesn't respond to threats by retreating. He responds by hunting. The road back to the valley felt longer in the dark. Ethan and Walt drove without speaking, each man replaying the break-in from every angle. The USB drive in Ethan's coat pocket felt heavier than steel. Proof like that could topple a man like Robert Hayes, if they could stay alive long enough to use it. Snow had stopped falling hours ago, but the wind still prowled through the pines, rattling branches like warning bones. Walt slowed as the truck turned onto the narrow downhill road leading to the cabin. The headlight swept across the clearing. Ethan's hand dropped to his holster. 2 sets of footprints cut through the untouched snow. Fresh, minutes old. "Get down," he said. Walt killed the headlights. The truck eased to a stop 50 yards from the porch. The cabin itself looked calm. Light still glowed through the curtains. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. Nothing broken, nothing forced. But Ethan knew better than to trust what looked peaceful. "Security?" Walt whispered. "Hayes wouldn't send cops," Ethan murmured. "He'd send men who don't make reports." They slipped out of the truck, boots sinking silently into the snow. Ethan motioned for Walt to circle out toward the barn while he approached from the opposite side. The men who'd been here, who might still be here, were trained. Their footprints were spaced evenly, purposeful, moving toward the porch with the confidence of men who expected no resistance. The cabin door was closed, but not fully. The latch hadn't caught. Ethan's throat tightened. Irene knows better than that. He pressed one ear to the wood. Inside, nothing. Too quiet. A house with a child and a dog should have been filled with sound. Ranger's nails clicking, Emma whispering, Irene moving between stove and fireplace. But the silence was complete. Ethan slipped inside. The living room was warm, the fire burning in a low cradle of coals just as they'd left it. Emma's quilt lay folded neatly near the hearth. Her drawings, crayons scattered around them, were still on the table. Ranger wasn't in sight. Neither was Emma. "Walt," Ethan whispered, voice sharp. "Inside. Now." Walt rushed in through the back door, shotgun raised. "They ain't here." "They left in a hurry," Ethan said. "Too neat to be a struggle. Irene must have moved her." The 2 men moved room to room, bedroom, pantry, back hall. The house was empty, but nothing had been taken. No signs of a break-in, no overturned chairs, just absence. Ethan stopped in the kitchen. A note sat under a salt shaker. Walt picked it up, squinting at the handwriting. "It's Irene's." Ethan unfolded it. 4 short lines were written in Irene's soft script. 2 men came to the door. They claimed they were officers looking for Emma. Something felt wrong. Took her to the root cellar. Stay low. Come fast. Walt let out a breath. Smart woman. Ethan was already moving. Root cellar, now. Behind the cabin, the small wooden cellar door sat half buried in snow. Ethan cleared it with one swipe of his arm. Walt lifted the latch. It opened soundlessly, meaning Irene had oiled it recently, expecting she might need it. A lantern flickered below. Irene's voice rose softly. "Is it you, boys?" "It's us," Walt said. "Bringing a storm with us?" They climbed down the narrow steps. Irene stood beside a stack of preserves, lantern trembling in her hand. Emma was wrapped in quilts on a cot, Ranger curled protectively around her legs. The dog growled the instant he saw Ethan until he recognized the scent and pushed his head into Ethan's palm. Emma looked up, eyes wide but steady. "Are we safe now?" "For the moment," Ethan said. "You did good listening to Irene." Emma nodded, face pale. "They knocked twice. They said I had to come with them because I was missing. But Ranger stood in front of me and growled. That's when Irene pulled me toward the stairs." Irene's voice cracked. "One of them kept a hand near his holster. He didn't even show a badge." Walt shook his head. "They'll be back, and next time they won't knock." Ethan crouched in front of Emma. "Sweetheart, did you see their faces?" "Yes," she whispered. "One had a scar on his cheek, and he smelled like cigars." She paused. "The other one? He knew Daddy. He said Daddy wanted me home." Irene sat on the cot and held Emma's shoulders gently. "No one who wants you home sends men like that." Ethan stood, running a hand through his hair. "We can't stay here. Hayes knows the valley. He'll search every inch of it before sunrise." Walt crossed his arms. "Where do we take her?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "To Maria? She can get Emma into protective custody before Hayes spins another lie." "That's a haul through mountain roads," Walt said. "And if Hayes has road watchers?" "They'll be watching the main highways," Ethan replied. "Not the backlogging roads." A heavy thump echoed from outside. Everyone froze. A second thump followed, closer this time. Snow shifting. Boots moving. Ranger rose in one fluid motion, standing tall despite his limp. The fur along his spine lifted like a ridge. His growl deepened, vibrating through the cellar walls. Emma clutched his collar. "They're back!" Ethan motioned for silence and killed the lantern. The cellar dropped into darkness so complete, the breath of the person beside you was the only proof they existed. Above them, a man's voice spoke through the floorboards. "Thought you could hide her?" Walt stiffened. He recognized that voice. Dale Riker, the ex-cop Hayes trusted most. "Check the barn," Dale called. "Check the woodshed. She's close." Boot steps spread out, heavy, confident, like men walking on land they believed they owned. Irene pulled Emma closer, whispering against her hair. "They won't get you? Not tonight." Ranger braced himself at the foot of the stairs. Ethan crouched beside him, hand steady on the dog's shoulder. "You ready?" Ethan whispered. Ranger's only answer was a low, fierce rumble. Above, the cellar door handle rattled once, twice, then stopped. Dale's voice came again, closer now. "Ethan Walker, you're a long way from Navy property, aren't you? I know you're in there. Hayes knows, too. So let's not make this harder." Walt muttered, "You'd think men like this would retire into something peaceful." Ethan shook his head. "Men like this don't retire. They rot." The cellar door rattled again, harder. Irene squeezed Emma's hand. "Close your eyes, sweetheart." Ethan moved to the base of the steps, every nerve poised. Suddenly, the rattling stopped. Silence, then footsteps. Retreating. Dale shouted to his men, "We sweep north first. He won't leave the girl. They'll have to move soon." More footsteps, crunching snow, fading slowly. Ethan waited another full minute before breathing. "They're widening the search," he whispered. "We need to move before they circle back." Walt nodded. "I'll start the truck." Emma looked up, trembling. "Are they going to hurt us?" Ethan crouched again, meeting her eyes with a calm he didn't entirely feel. "Not if I breathe first. Do you trust me?" Emma nodded immediately, small but sure. "Yes." Ranger licked her cheek as if adding his own promise. Ethan stood. "We go out the back trail. Stay low. No lights. Walt, take point." Walt grabbed his coat. "I'll clear the path." Irene wrapped Emma in a heavier quilt and kissed her forehead. "I'll be right behind you." Ethan carried Emma up the stairs while Ranger kept close, his paws silent. Outside, the mountain was dark again. Too quiet, too cold, too still. But Ethan felt the shift. Hayes wasn't hiding anymore. He was hunting. And now that he knew Emma was alive, he would burn the mountain down to find her. Ethan tightened his grip on the girl and stepped into the night. One thing was certain: they would not outrun the danger. They would have to outsmart it. The courthouse in Durango had seen storms before, summer tempests shaking the windows, winter blizzards packing the steps with ice. But it had never held a storm like the one gathering inside its walls that morning. Reporters crowded the sidewalk, cameras perched on their shoulders, breath fogging in the cold March air. Police stood in pairs near the entrance, radios humming, eyes flicking between journalists and the courthouse doors. Inside, the benches filled slowly. People from town, officers who'd followed the case, attorneys with stiff expressions, they all settled into place with the same expectant hush. Everyone could feel the weight of what was coming, but no one felt it more than the small girl sitting beside Walt and Irene Miller. Emma wore a navy sweater far too big for her, sleeves covering her hands, the collar pulled at her throat. Irene had braided her hair that morning, weaving in a thin ribbon to keep it neat. Ranger lay at her feet, chin resting on his paws, eyes alert, watching every movement in the room. Ethan stood 2 rows behind them, broad shoulders drawn tight, jaw clenched. He wore a simple jacket, nothing flashy, nothing polished. He didn't need a uniform to look like a man ready to face down a threat. Maria Sanchez sat beside him, one hand gripping a thick folder of evidence, her expression steady and sure. Across the aisle sat the defendants. Robert Hayes entered first, flanked by 2 attorneys. His suit was expensive, tailored within an inch of perfection, but it couldn't hide the tension in his jaw. His eyes swept the room and landed on Emma. He froze. For a brief second, something like fear flickered across his face, just a flash, but when he blinked, it vanished, replaced by a mask of fatherly grief. Then came Tiffany. Her platinum hair was pulled back in a sleek twist, her lips set in a trembling pout that might have fooled someone who didn't know better. She dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, as if the very sight of Emma brought her unbearable sorrow. But her gaze slid over the room too quickly, calculating, polished, rehearsed. Ranger growled under his breath. Emma's hand moved instantly to his fur, fingers curling tight. When the judge finally entered, the room rose as one, wood creaking, murmurs falling into silence. Judge Rowan was in his late 50s, a man with silver hair combed neatly back and a gaze sharp enough to cut through the kind of lies attorneys spent years learning to polish. "Court is now in session," he said, voice echoing through the room. "State of Colorado versus Robert Hayes and Tiffany Hayes." The prosecutor, Daniel Brooks, a man known for his calm demeanor and razor-sharp logic, stood and began to outline the charges: attempted murder, conspiracy, endangerment, financial fraud. For each count, the judge's pen scratched once across a page. When Daniel finished, Robert's attorney rose with an air of offended dignity. "Your Honor, my client is a respected businessman, a philanthropist, a father. He rushed to report his missing daughter. It's unthinkable he would harm her." Murmurs rippled across the room, but Ethan didn't move. He watched Robert, watched how the man's fingers drummed the table when the word father was used. A tick of irritation, not grief. The prosecutor called witnesses. First was Maria. She spoke clearly, professionally, laying out the investigative trail, financial transfers, inconsistencies in Laura Hayes' death report, the disabled vehicle system, the forged maintenance documents. Then she played the video. The courtroom screens came alive with the grainy image of a snowy mountain road, the SUV idling, the door opening, Emma stepping out with Ranger, the car pulling away, the small figure collapsing to her knees as the taillights vanished into the storm. Tiffany gasped loudly, too loudly, a performance. Robert's attorney jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this footage is taken out of context, clearly edited," but the judge held up a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Keaton." Emma stared at the screen with a stillness Ethan had come to recognize. Not numb, not detached, just quiet. Quiet the way a wounded animal becomes when its learned crying doesn't help. Walt rested a hand gently on her shoulder. Irene dabbed her eyes with a trembling tissue. Next came Hannah Lee, the accountant who had worked under Tiffany for years. Her voice shook as she testified about the shell companies, the pressure to reroute funds, the whispered conversations she overheard. She looked at Emma only once, and when she did, her voice steadied. "I should have come forward sooner," she said. "I didn't see what was happening to the child behind the numbers." The judge nodded once. "You're here now. The court acknowledges that." Then came the moment no one could prepare for. Daniel approached the witness stand. "We call Emma Hayes." Everything stopped. Irene squeezed Emma's hand. Walt stood to help her, but Emma shook her head. "I can walk," she whispered. Ranger followed close, tail low, ears forward, protective as a shadow. The judge allowed it. No one dared argue against a dog who'd saved the child's life. Emma climbed into the witness chair, feet dangling inches above the floor. Daniel knelt in front of her, not patronizing, not babying, just bringing himself to her height. "Emma," he said softly, "I'm going to ask you a few questions. If you need a break, you tell me. If you don't understand something, you tell me. All right?" She nodded. "Do you remember the night you were found in the storm?" Her throat bobbed. "Yes." "Did anyone push you out of the car?" "No." She hesitated. "He told me to get out." "Who did?" "My dad." Robert shifted in his seat. Tiffany touched his arm dramatically, as if comforting him, but he didn't look comforted. He looked like a man trying not to bolt. Daniel kept going, gentle but firm. "Did he say he would return for you?" Emma nodded. "He said he'd pick me up in a minute, but he didn't come back." Silence swept the courtroom again. Daniel let it settle before asking the question that cut deepest. "Emma, do you believe your father intended to return?" Emma looked at Ranger. The dog lifted his head and touched his nose to her knee. She looked back at Daniel, eyes steady. "No," she whispered. "He wasn't coming back." Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Tiffany looked away. Robert's jaw twitched. Daniel offered Emma a small smile. "Thank you, sweetheart. You've done very well." He returned to his table, but before she climbed down, Judge Rowan leaned slightly forward. "Emma, I have one question for you." She blinked. "Yes, sir?" "When you think about what happened, is there anything you want to tell this court? In your own words?" Emma swallowed, fingers tightening in Ranger's fur. "Yes," she said. The judge nodded. "Go on." Her voice was soft, but it carried through the stillness like a bell. A dad who loves you doesn't leave you in the cold. The words hit harder than any attorney's speech. By the time Emma returned to Irene's arms, half the courtroom was quietly wiping tears they were trying to hide. Even Ranger seemed to settle beside her with a heavier sigh, as if he understood that something had finally been set down. When the prosecution rested, Robert's attorney tried to recover ground, but the damage was done. Each attempt to blame the storm, to blame a miscommunication, to call it an accident, only made the truth more obvious. Robert had no defense for the cold. When closing arguments ended, the jury left to deliberate. It took 40 minutes. When they returned, none of them looked confused or conflicted. Some looked angry, some looked sad, but all looked certain. The foreman rose. "We find the defendant, Robert Hayes, guilty on all counts. And Tiffany Hayes, guilty of conspiracy and financial fraud." Emma didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She simply leaned into Irene, letting the woman wrap her arms around her. Ranger placed his paw on her foot, as if to say, "It's over now. It's over." Ethan watched the verdict land like the closing of a long, dark door. But he also knew something else. This wasn't the end of Emma's story. This was the beginning of the part where she finally got to live it. Spring came late to the San Juan Mountains. Even in April, small pockets of snow clung stubbornly to the shaded slopes, as if winter were reluctant to let go. But down in the valley where the Miller cabin sat, the world was beginning to wake. Meltwater trickled down the rocks. The creek ran louder each morning, and the pines smelled fresher, greener. Inside the cabin, the warmth felt different now. Not the emergency heat of survival, not the anxious comfort of temporary shelter, but something softer, something steady. Something like a home putting itself back together after too many quiet years. Emma sat at the old wooden table beside the window, coloring in a picture she had started weeks earlier. A sunrise over a mountain ridge. Ranger lay beside her chair with his head resting on her foot, content to be used as an anchor. Every few minutes, Emma would reach down and stroke behind his ears, an unconscious gesture that had become part of her breathing. Walt was repairing a loose hinge on the back door, humming under his breath. Irene was at the stove, stirring a pot of chicken and dumplings whose scent filled every corner of the house. Light filtered through the curtains, warm and honey-colored. For the first time since the storm, Emma looked like a child who wasn't waiting for something terrible to happen. Ethan arrived just after noon. The crunch of tires on gravel made Ranger lift his head. Emma followed his gaze and smiled when she saw Ethan's familiar truck rolling into the clearing. He stepped out, carrying a small duffel bag and a paper folder tucked under his arm. The mountain air had done him good. Some of the lines around his eyes had eased. The tension in his jaw softened. Ranger bounded toward him, tail swinging with unrestrained joy. Ethan knelt and let the dog barrel into him. "Well," Walt said from the porch, "look who wandered back into our neck of the woods." Ethan grinned. "Couldn't stay away." Walt clapped him on the back when he stepped up onto the porch. Irene hugged him warmly, smelling faintly of flower and lavender. "Come in," she said. "Dinner's not quite ready yet, but you're just in time to set the table." Ethan chuckled. "Yes, ma'am." Emma hovered near the doorway, eyes bright. "Did you bring news?" "I did," Ethan said softly. "Good news." They all gathered in the living room, the fire crackling and the smell of Irene's cooking drifting like a warm blanket. Ethan set the folder on the table. Ranger sat down beside Emma, leaning into her leg again. Ethan looked at Walt and Irene. "It's official. Judge Rowan signed the final order this morning." Irene clasped her hands together, a tear shining in her eye. Walt's chin trembled once, just once, but he cleared his throat to hide it. "Emma," Ethan said gently, turning to her, "the court has approved your guardianship. Walt and Irene are now your legal family. Your home is here, sweetheart." Emma froze. The room held its breath. Then she launched forward, bearing herself against Irene's chest. The older woman wrapped her arms around the girl, rocking her gently as tears of relief spilled freely. Walt placed a hand on Emma's back, large, careful, trembling. Ranger lifted his head and gave a single soft bark, as if saying he approved of the arrangement. Ethan smiled, though his throat tightened a little. "There's more," he said once the room settled. "Your mother's trust will be managed by an independent firm. No one can ever touch your inheritance again. When you're older, it'll be yours to use however you choose." Emma wiped her face. "I want to do something good with it." "You already are," Irene whispered. Emma hesitated. "Ethan, why did Judge Rowan ask me if I wanted to stay here? Didn't he already know?" Ethan crouched before her, meeting her eyes. "Because, Emma, the law can decide a lot of things. But family, real family, is a choice, and he wanted to hear your choice." Emma looked at Walt and Irene. "I chose them. I want to stay." Walt pulled her into a hug again, quieter this time. "We're not going anywhere, kiddo." The afternoon settled into a warm, steady rhythm. Irene set the table with her best dishes, not because anyone told her to, but because tonight felt like it deserved something special. Walt lit the old lantern they used on holidays. Ranger circled the kitchen twice before settling near Emma's chair, ready to catch any dumpling that might fall. When they finally sat down to dinner, laughter edged into the conversation, the kind that comes slowly at first, after sorrow has lived in a house too long. Emma ate like a child who finally felt safe enough to be hungry. Irene kept fussing over her portion, adding more chicken, more dumplings, more everything. Walt told a story about the time he got a mule stuck in a snowbank during his mining days. Ranger snored once, loudly, and made Emma giggle. Near the end of the meal, there was a knock at the door. Emma stiffened, but Ethan rose quickly. "It's all right. I'm expecting this." He opened the door. Chaplain Ben stood there, holding a weathered envelope and wearing a smile that softened the edges of his lined face. His coat was dusted with snow, his glasses fogged from the warmth inside. "Evening, folks," he said. "Hope I'm not interrupting supper." "You're just in time," Walt said, waving him in. Ben handed the envelope to Ethan. "Came in the mail today, addressed to Emma." Emma blinked. "To me?" Ethan handed it to her with a nod. "Go ahead." Her small fingers tore the flap carefully. Inside was a check, folded around a handwritten note. Emma unfolded it, eyes widening. "It's from Miss Hannah," she whispered. "From the lady at the court. She sent this to help build a place for kids who don't have anyone." Irene pressed a hand to her mouth. Walt leaned forward. "How much?" Emma held up the check. Ben whistled softly. "That'll get something mighty important off the ground." Ethan touched Emma's shoulder. "Looks like someone believed in you, kiddo." Emma looked at the note again. Her voice trembled as she read, "So no child ever has to stand alone in the storm again." The room went quiet. It wasn't a sad silence. It was the kind that wraps itself around the heart and stays there. A silence of healing, of something broken finally being put right. As sunset faded into twilight, they gathered on the porch, mugs of cocoa warming their hands. The valley glowed with the last light of day, soft gold spilling across the snow. Ranger stood beside Emma, chest lifted, ears tall, a guardian satisfied with his work. Ben rested against the railing. "Storm's over," he murmured. Ethan nodded. "This one is." Emma tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "Will you visit, even when you're busy?" He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "As long as you want me here. You yell, I'll come running." "Like you did in the snow?" A small smile touched Ethan's mouth, sad, warm, grateful. "Yeah, exactly like that." Ranger barked once, sharp and bright, as if agreeing with all of it. The last of the daylight slipped behind the ridge. Lantern light glowed through the cabin windows, warm and steady. The family, Walt, Irene, Emma, Ranger, Ethan, and even old Chaplain Ben, stood shoulder to shoulder against the fading cold. And for the first time since the night she was abandoned on that frozen mountain road, Emma Hayes looked out at the world and did not feel afraid. She felt chosen, she felt safe, she felt home. Because in the end, family isn't made by blood. It's made by the people who stay when the storm tries to take you. And this time, the storm had lost. Eat nay. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments so I know you're still here, still listening, still believing in the good that's left in this world. And if you'd like to walk with us through more true-to-life miracles, more quiet acts of courage, and more stories where loyalty still matters, make sure you subscribe before you go. There's another journey waiting for you in the next video.